Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. My name is Tony Showala. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the operations lead for RSA US. And on behalf of the RSA global community, I would humbly like to thank all of you for joining us for this month's salon titled Considering the Inequalities of Climate Change, a Conversation. Before we get started, I'd like to give a little bit of background on the RSA, RSA US, and hand it over to my colleagues in Wales and Canada to share about the RSA in their respective regions, as well as cover some ground rules about today's event. So, founded in the UK, we are the Royal Society for Arts, Manufacturers, and Commerce, and have been uniting people and ideas to resolve the challenges of our time since 1754. March 22nd of 1754, to be specific, which is tomorrow and our 270th birthday anniversary. Um, Today, the Society exists as an international fellowship driven social change organization. We're committed to a world that is resilient, rebalanced, and regenerative, where everyone can reach their full potential. Our proven change process, rigorous research initiative, innovative ideas, platforms, and unique global network of 31,000 change makers work collectively to enable people, places, and the planet to flourish. Of the 31,000 fellows spread around the globe, we have about 1,100 who live and work here in the United States, including Carrie Norton, who's joining us today. And RSA US exists to coordinate fellowship activities in the United States with an aim towards moving the needle on addressing the inequalities of our society. So I'll pass it over to my colleague Kate to share a little bit about what RSA looks like in Wales.
Folks, welcome to the conversation today. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the Fellowship Engagement Managers for the RSA. I look after the southwest of England and the country of Wales, along with a group of fellows who are part of a panel to represent the diversity of the whole country. In Wales, we have about 600 fellows based across a whole range of different industries, including education and farming and the arts. And we are looking at the future generations. It's been a theme throughout Welsh life over the last few years. And the RSA is joining that conversation about the well-being of our children and our children's generations and how we can bring some of our own regenerative thinking to that. One of my panel, Zandrea Stewart, was due to be here today, and unfortunately she's unable to attend due to a family issue. But as Zandrea, based in Wales, was part of the inspiration for our today's conversation, I want to appreciate her and her commitment to continuing to host conversations around this particular theme. So thank you, Zandrea. And I'll pass the word to Nishan.
Thank you, Kate. I am Nishan Chalvachandran. I am actually an RSA fellow, and I'm also the network lead for the RSA in Canada. I'm calling today from Eastern Finland, from the ancestral lands of the Kaialaset people, an area also known as Eastern or North Karelia, I should say. But I also wanted to do a more broad land acknowledgement for the territorial and First Nations peoples of Canada, whose lands many of our fellows, or in fact all of our fellows in Canada, work on, live on, and play on and interact with. So for the Canadian perspective, I guess, the RSA has, or I say the RSA has, there are 300, or at least 300 fellows in Canada, spread across the provinces and territories. And as Kate also alluded to, the span of fellows very much comprises of a range of people with different backgrounds from different sectors: teachers, educators, social entrepreneurs, students, the list goes on, artists and musicians and whatnot. And we're also working very hard to really incorporate the thinking and traditional knowledge of First Nations and Indigenous peoples within the construct of the RSA Fellowship and also hopefully within the RSA itself. Um, as Tony also mentioned, that the RSA is on its 270th birthday, and the RSA has actually had interactions with Canada since the 18th century, nearing its inception. So I think one of the things that fuels the interactions with Canada, especially, is that sense of history and legacy, but also looking at things through a truth and reconciliatory lens, and how we can actually incorporate our learnings from legacy and heritage into a regenerative mindset, which there's a lot of active work happening right now in Canada. I'm pleased actually today that flying the Canadian flag on behalf of the fellows is James Storch from the Institute for Community Prosperity, based at Mount Royal University in Calgary. But on that note, I believe I will hand back to Tony, and then we'll perhaps get started with our conversation.
Thanks so much, Nish. So actually, before we get started, one of the things that we like to do with folks is just go over some ground rules that we have. If you were in the waiting room, you've likely seen this slide, but we just want to highlight a few things. First off, as I mentioned before, this conversation is being recorded. We encourage all folks and are always aspiring to do our best in these spaces of using language that celebrates people's humanity, creating spaces for all voices. So, being intentional and aware of how we're showing up and considering the impact that we're having, and then connecting with one another authentically. And we're going to do our best to create space for all of those things to happen. And we'll also look to you all to help in facilitating that too. If, as we're going through the conversation today, if you need anything or have any questions, please reach out to me in the chat. My screen name is RSA US Events Tony Showala, or my colleagues Kate or Nish are also available if you have any specific questions for them. And with that, I'm going to transition over to, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to transition over to Carrie Norton, who's going to lead us in a grounding meditation to start our time together.
Hello. Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a fraught topic. And so we felt like it would make sense for us to work together to just really arrive in this room and in this space so that we can all be fully present to experience this conversation in a really embodied way. So part of my practice is as a meditation instructor, and part of that practice includes inviting people into breath work. So many of you may be familiar at this point with the notion of box breathing, or the effect that breathing itself, just breathing, can, if done intentionally, really regulate the nervous system. So if you wish, you can turn your screen off or not. We're going to just do a little bit of breathing together to really ground ourselves in this virtual world. So you can just follow along with me, and I invite you to, I'm not going to get these numbers right, doesn't really matter, but basically we're going to do an in-breath, we're going to hold, and then we're going to do an out-breath. And we'll do that 4 or 5 times. And you can do 4, 5, 6, or 5, 6, 8, or just whatever works for you. But the key is to do it in that order. And I think, technically speaking, if you hold in longer than you breathe in, and you breathe out longer than you hold, that's sort of the progression. So let's begin with 4 count breath inward. 1, 2, 3, 4. Holding for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then breathing out for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you can practice that on your own now. I won't narrate. We'll just do that for another minute or so. Okay, if you want to take your last round, and then we can come back together in the space. And back over to you, Tony.
Well, that felt lovely. Thank you so much, Carrie. I'm actually going to transition it over to my colleague, Kate Monkhouse, who's going to be doing a lot of the moderation of today's session.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Kerry, for helping us just to breathe and to settle into this space together. That's really appreciated. And that's because today's salon aims to provide a space for contemplation and conversation, to hear and to acknowledge the real experience of climate change upon ourselves, individuals, and communities within our local environments, with a focus on those who are already experiencing social and health inequality, especially. We want to recognise today that our speakers are not being positioned as experts in this space, and that we are here to facilitate and hold the conversation with each of us to share our own experiences and our own journeys. So with that in mind, do be aware that this conversation, as Tony said, is being recorded, so share as much as you feel comfortable sharing. We have the opportunity today to move into a facilitated breakout groups later, so that will provide the chance to have confidential conversations that are not recorded. And we will also provide any links that may be useful throughout the conversation, so please feel free to include information that you think would be helpful to share. So we are who we are in the room today. If we were having this conversation in a different space, a different country, a different time, the experiences may well be very different. But today I'm so pleased to welcome James Storch and Carrie Norton and Nishan Shalvachandran. They will each introduce themselves and share an example of how climate change has become present in their own lives. And as you're listening to them, you're very welcome to add some of your own experiences and observations or responses into the chat too. So please let me pass the word first to James.
Thank you, Kate. So hi, everyone. I'm speaking to you today from the Treaty 7 portion of the Siksikaitsitapi, or better known as Blackfoot. In Montana, you would say Blackfeet region, which roughly stretches from the North Saskatchewan River, so the modern-day city of Edmonton in the north, all the way down to what is now Yellowstone Park in Wyoming, Montana. and into the Rockies on the western side. Within this territory, I have borne witness, along with millions of others who visited the Athabasca Glacier. And I noticed that Jonathan, I think, commented on the Patagonia region and the visceral awareness, if you're a hiker, to seeing glaciers recede. The Athabasca Glacier is quite a tourist attraction. So you can stop along the Banff Jasper Highway, and in the 1960s, 70s, the nose of the glacier was quite close to the highway. You could just saunter over to it in a matter of feet. And with each passing year and decade, of course, the glacier has receded. The glacier is important because uniquely in the world, it actually feeds three oceans, the Arctic, the Atlantic, and the Pacific, because it straddles the continental divide. And so we've seen, like, I remember visiting it in the 90s and seeing they would mark it along the trail every place that the nose of the glacier was in a preceding year. And so the distance between those markers used to be a matter of a few feet each year, and then a few meters. And now to get to the nose of the glacier, it's a pretty grueling hike. So it's an awful long way from the highway. And so it's just kind of a very clear physical piece of evidence, because we can look at weather and decide to attribute it to climate change or not, but it's pretty hard to turn away from that kind of evidence. And it's important now as well because mountains are kind of water towers. And so partially because of the retreat of the glaciers and changing weather patterns, we're preparing in this part of the world for an historic drought that we have not experienced since European contact. And that is something that we know abstractly is coming, but we're about to enter a summer that will be quite visceral. A little later in the discussion, if time permits, I can go through some of the facts and figures about the epic fires that have also visited Canada, and it's changed the atmospheric landscape such that we're now Canada, out of the top 15 most polluted cities in North America last year, we actually had 14 of the top 15. They are largely working class northern cities with very large indigenous populations. And they are more polluted than the largest US cities, at least last year. And it probably will be the case going forward for most of the coming future. So I'll stop there. I should mention as well, I currently run the Institute for Nonprofit Studies, or sorry, the Institute for Community Prosperity, as it's now called, at Mount Royal University. And I will put into the chat a series of scans we do each year that basically help the public sense make around some of these issues, including climate change and inequality. So thank you.
All right.
Hello. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I'm calling today from the greater Los Angeles area, which is also known as the land of the Tongva and the Chumash, and also known in other ways as the South Coast bioregion. And that language of bioregionalism will become relevant for this conversation. But I just want to contextualize what brings me here. That is first as a fellow of the RSA and as co-lead of the RSA's Greater Los Angeles chapter alongside Kat Calvin, who's someone you should all know about. Her really important work. Maybe we could drop that in the chat, Tony. Is critical, especially in this election year here in the United States. But I was drawn into the RSA specifically because of their attention to regeneration, and even more specifically during the pandemic, when one of my most important teachers, Daniel Christian Wall, was awarded I forget which medal it is, but an important medal by the RSA for his work in designing regenerative cultures. And I've been following Daniel for quite a while, and somehow I stumbled upon his address, which I really encourage you all to watch. It can also be furnished in the chat, or we can send it to you after the fact. So Daniel just speaks really eloquently about the importance of regenerative cultures, and I was intrigued by, candidly drawn into the RSA primarily by the conversation around the arts. I didn't realize the history, its history as related to commerce, for example, or manufacturing even. But I think we need a lot of artistic tools in this time, and we need to summon our greatest creativity to respond to the inequalities of climate change and the impacts broadly. So I'm here because of Daniel, because of that address, and because of RSA's broad attention to the conversation around regeneration through the Regeneration Rising podcast, which Daniel and Josie Warden hosted last year with some of the leading voices in the regenerative movement globally, and which continues this year with the leadership of Daniel and Philippa Duthie. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, also of the RSA. So if you're looking to get educated or learn anything about regeneration, I think those two podcast series are some of the best places to begin. And I show up today with a few different hats, looking through a regenerative lens, and that is through regenerative leadership development, regenerative and systems-oriented consulting through my practice at Upstream Studio, and through the Global Regenerative Finance Initiative, which is looking to really redesign finance in service to life. So that's a little bit about me.
Nishan.
Thank you, Kate. I'm actually a bit of a last minute addition as a speaker. I didn't actually know I was going to be a speaker until about 30 minutes ago. I was supposed to just be lurking in the shadows, so my input might be slightly different, let's say. Well, first off, thanks, Carrie, for actually mentioning Regeneration Rising, the RSA podcast, because that was something that I was going to mention. Philippa Duthie, Josie Warden, in particular, really crafted the RSA's regenerative thinking, regenerative design strategy back, way back when, I guess, and that very much frames a lot of the work that the RSA is looking at now around regeneration. Of course, having Daniel Weil on the podcast as well, I think it's a really impactful podcast. It's a great listen, and I think it really embodies some of the RSA's work quite nicely, at least from an intentionality point of view. So I guess just very briefly, I'm a bit of an oddball fellow. I joined the fellowship on the invitation of a university mentor some years back. My background is actually in technology, so I'm a technology entrepreneur. I have a consultancy here in Finland, but we do a lot of work around the world. But when I say technology, it's very much the intersection of technology and, I guess, environmental and human centricism. So a lot of the work that I do is, or as an example, stemmed in work with UN SDGs and helping municipalities and organizations align their outputs and services with the UN SDGs. So from a forward or a public impact or public-centric point of view, helping municipalities and governments, align what they're doing against the UN SDGs as a benchmark to try and figure out where their shortfalls are and what they're doing very well. I think, which is generally quite helpful, especially in the environmental conversation. I'm wanting to, rather than just throw some academic facts and figures at you, not there's anything wrong with academia, James, but I was just mindful that I wanted to just give some, I guess, visceral or some, I guess, dare I say, anecdotal examples, or at least some examples of things that I've experienced and that I've been impacted when it comes to so-called climate change, and I'll use that term in a loaded way. So I live in eastern Finland, which is a very rural area. It's very much the Finnish government, the Finnish Minister for the Interior referred to this area in a conversation with them as the flyover states of Finland, which shows the disdain that the Finnish government has for the farming and rural communities of Finland. I'm not going to go into any political arguments, but that's just my view. I think that's actually quite reflective of perhaps a lot of regions around the world where rural and agricultural communities that generally are perhaps the hardest hitting, or at least at the front lines of our climate emergencies, tend to be forgotten about from a systemic point of view. But so as an example in Finland where I live on an old dairy farm and surrounded by forest and some farming fields. But as I look out of my window, there's a few acres of what is now farming field. But 50, no, I was going to say 50 years, actually 100 years ago now, that was actually all part of Lake Saimaa. And the Roxy River, which runs between Russia and Finland, was dammed for hydroelectric power back in the late 20s, early 30s. A noble effort, of course, hydroelectric power, even though currently the state electricity company does not run the dam, because by running the dam, the electricity prices will be so low that they would not turn a profit. So that's, again, another conversation for another day. But since the formation of that dam, it changed the watershed of the Saimaa, which affected a lot of the seals in the area, the Saimaa seal being a very specific seal only found in Finland. And the watershed drew back and exposed a lot of land that is now used as farmland. So maybe there's a positive impact in that there was more land to use as farmland, but also quite negative in terms of the marine life and the ecosystem and the inadvertent effect that man-made impact had on the ecosystem. So that's something that I see every day. When I think staying in Finland, and I could do like a quick flyover to some experience from some examples from around the world. So in northern Finland, in Lapland, of course, with the increasing temperatures and connecting with what James was talking about with the receding glaciers. So a lot of the permafrost in the north is melting. A lot of the what's called in the Sami language, which is the indigenous Finnish language, the palsa, which is the bog, the mossy bog that also, I guess, lives with the permafrost. Because of the melting permafrost, that's changing into moorland, which in turn is causing the birch forests to change into pine forests, and it's totally changing the forest ecosystem. But because the forest ecosystem is changing, the types of moss that grow change. And because of the lack of permafrost and this different type of moss, it's creating a freeze-thaw effect, which is quite different to the way it's always been. And the reason why I mention that, because we might think, well, what difference does it make if there's a different type of frost that freezes solid now versus one that never used to freeze? But that means that there are now hundreds and thousands of reindeer that are dying. The population of reindeer in the Arctic North is dramatically decreasing because there is no food for them in the winter because of this changing ecological impact from climate change. And of course, the indigenous reindeer herders are having to use feeds and other such things to maintain their herds, which is not necessarily sustainable. We talk about regeneration, and I see regeneration as the next step from sustainability. But if sustainability is just trying to make sure that we do things, I guess at a net zero kind of way, I don't think we're even there yet for a lot of things. But of course, and what we're seeing with the melting of the polar ice caps and the Arctic regions is, rather than triggering what I would like to think of as a climate emergency, we're seeing commercial opportunities and the opening of maritime and shipping routes. and the opening up of mineral mining. So Finland, again, was referred to by the EU recently as Europe's frontier for mineral mining. And they're trying to push through some legislation to allow reopen old strip mines looking for cobalt and other rare minerals in the Lapland and Arctic North, which falls predominantly on Sami and indigenous land. And the legislation is essentially recategorizing the land to enable the government and other organizations to conduct these really harmful and awful mining practices to extract these resources that were otherwise unreachable because of the adverse conditions. So that's something that is worrying. And then I'll quickly flip over to Canada before I hand the mic back, because I'm mindful that I'm doing a lot of talking here. Or two things quickly. One thing, when as I'm talking about human impact. For those people that are in the UK and are familiar with Northern England, specifically the Lake District, there's a famous or infamous reservoir called it's called Haweswater Reservoir. It's a man-made lake. Originally, the village that was occupying that area, people were relocated to provide. They wanted to provide a reservoir for growing Manchester at the time. This is post World War II. And so after moving people out, they had the Royal Air Force do bombing runs on the village to practice bombing, and before they prepared the dam, and they flooded the valley to create this huge reservoir. When I was last there a few years back, when the UK was seeing some of the hottest and driest weather on record, the reservoir was at its lowest levels since it was created decades ago. And it was an eerie sight seeing old church spires and roofs of buildings that were poking out from the water level. Again, I guess this taps into the thinking about regeneration and resilient thinking, and how the legacy of some of the things that we've done in the architecture of our systems, which may have been suitable at the time, might not necessarily be appropriate or adequate in the needs in the environment that we have now. And lastly, of course, talking on infrastructure before I hand back, in Canada, especially when it comes to water, and I think water is a bit of my theme, so it seems. But across Canada, there's 32 boil water advisories across 28 Indigenous or First Nations communities. So a boil water advisory being that the water that's coming in from the tap isn't safe to drink, and they need to boil it in order for it to be safe. Whilst that can happen sometimes in contaminated water supplies, and I think during times of crisis or floods and whatnot, drinking water sometimes can become contaminated. But these communities have been facing this challenge for over 30 years for many cases. So it very much bothers me when we have generations that are being affected by these systemic failings and problems, and when the answer very much tends to be that the policy is challenging, or it takes a lot of work for governments to do that. I like to point the finger at the government, especially right now. I was surprised how US Congress was so quickly able to pass a bill with a potential ban of TikTok from across the aisle. Yet we're talking about an app versus some of these challenges that are really threatening our existence across the board, and yet we don't have the same level of urgency, so it seems, at the policy level. So a couple of little nuggets of radicalism perhaps to drop in there. I'll just hand back to Kate.
Lovely, Nishan. Thank you so much for starting with the SDGs and for finishing with a question around policy change, and for giving us those examples in the middle. Thank you, Kerry, for highlighting your experience, including within the financial sector, and James for talking about glaciers and the change to the weather. That resonates a little bit with what Jonathan has added into the chat. It's really interesting to hear that mix of the journeys that all of us have been on so far. And indeed, those specific examples that we can feel and touch around us. And as I said before, if we're having this conversation with a different group of people in a different country at a different time, we would have a different range of experiences to share. So that's what we want to go to now. I'm going to
Can I grab the mic for a minute? I realized I overlooked a part of the assignment, and so I just want to bring it in because I forgot to name my own visceral experience with climate change, and also just want to make a couple of quick comments. So I would say I have three sort of milestones that have driven further my awareness of the fact that this is not a future event. And I think it's, we tend to fall into the trap of talking about climate change in the future tense. So I'm trying to be really intentional about living it in the present. And so, first of all, my my flying anxiety over the last decade has surfaced and peaked, and now is sort of I'm regrounding myself. But that is something very real, as I consider the very real potential of the collapse of the jet stream. Secondly, I got caught in Hurricane Fiona on Prince Edward Island. Was it last year or 2 years ago? I think 2 years ago, with my 94-year-old mother, where we had to evacuate our beach house to go to the only hotel that could survive a Category 5 hurricane, and where we were thankfully very well cared for 5 days without water, without power. And so that was just a very real experience of thinking that we could all get wiped away. And then finally, based in California here, which is something that's little known, we worry about what many of you may know is the big one here in California, which is an earthquake that's supposed to happen any minute now. But if you would like to read the link that Tony may be able to post in the chat from the New York Times, very comprehensive study of the real threat to California, which is the big flood. And in the rains that we've experienced just in this year alone, it's not the only time we've had a lot of flooding. I sometimes feel like we're at the beginning of that big flood, that if it continues as imagined, will effectively destroy the California farming region, which represents 80% of the food produced in the United States and exported all around the world. So those are just a few examples of me coming in very close touch with the realities of the climate emergency as it is manifesting now.
Well, if I may jump in, if there is
let's just see. Is there anyone else who would like to contribute? Otherwise, I'd love to hear more from you, Nishan. Yeah, go for it.
So I'm the sort of person that ad-libs when when there's like long silences, so that's why I had an urge to say something. But I just wanted to I guess continue on, because Carrie made a really great point about farming dependency in California and how that affects a lot of Canada as well relies on the export of produce from Canada, and actually within our ecosystems around the world we have a dependency on farming and agriculture, and all of which are greatly suffering and impacted from climate challenges, but then also some of the pushback from policymaking as well. We're seeing across Europe the farming protests and whatnot. I wanted to put a caveat into what I was saying, because it sounded like I was being very critical of Finland, but of course I'm very grateful for Finland having the dare I say pristine or pretty amazing environment that they do have here. And of course I think compared to many other places, the government and I guess generally the ecosystem and people here are more mindful of their surroundings and climate impact. So it's easy for me to be critical whilst I'm enjoying forests and clean water, and enjoying my groundwater well that I have here on my farm. And I think of when I'm mentioning drinking water, because I think of I mentioned the UK with Haweswater Reservoir, but of course we're also seeing when it comes to wastewater and some of the horrific facts that it coming out of the UK when it comes to the failings of water treatment and untreated wastewater being dumped into the waterways and rivers and canals and the serious effects that that's having on communities on ecosystems and whatnot. So I think we definitely have this. To Carrie's point, we tend to look at climate change as a future thought of this is where we are going, so we must stop this. But actually, there's also a lot of stuff that is happening here and now, and I think if we stop and take a moment to see what's going on around us, we might realize that it's perhaps more closer to immediate that we might think. And as one quick example, and I'll hand the mic back. Last year, Finland saw one of the hottest summers on record, and I'm currently going through one of the coldest winters on record in Finland, where it's been consistently -30 to -40 since October. There's still snow on the ground now. I haven't seen the ground underneath the snow since October last year. But a very peculiar thing in speaking with, James will know I have great conversations with the monks in this area. There are some local monks that moved from Russia here. That's a conversation for another time. But a great font of knowledge when it comes to the environment and history, and also just some of the changes in the environment and their practices. But one of the strange things that we noticed last year were the fact that the mushrooms all came out in July. And mushrooms are a very autumnal, I guess, fruit, if you want to call them that, usually popping up in very mild, dank weather. That is the October, September time as a prelude to winter. But all of these autumnal mushrooms were popping up in end of June, in July. Everyone thinking it was very strange, but then of course the snow landed in October, and it was minus whatever it was ever since. So we had a very, very early winter, which seemed to accelerate everything else. So on one hand, it was fascinating that nature knew, so to speak, all the organisms and everything else. I think a lot of the organisms and whatnot that are in simpatico with the ecosystem were able to tell the changes, and how disconnected we are in terms of we're one of the very few organisms that live on this green blob that don't really necessarily jive with our surroundings so much. So just something that I wanted to throw in there. And also just to say that I think Fire Ape was my nickname in high school.
Amazing.
One of the things that is really tricky about the intersection of climate change and not just inequality, but really any other kind of like manifestation of the global polycrisis is that, and it's a paradox, the more we see visceral evidence of climate change and feel it in our own backyards and communities, there's always other issues that are more important. And so you would think that in the past year, we've seen, epic forest fires in Canada, all of these visceral effects, and yet climate change is nowhere close to the top of the national agenda. The issues are housing, the issues are affordability, the issues are youth mental health, the issues are food security. And that has always been so, and that will ever be so. And we have to figure out a way past that. We have to figure out a way to completely recast the climate crisis in other terms. We've seen decades ago, Inuit communities have reported on and have expressed concern about the felt effects of climate change, relocated communities, hunting patterns changing, migratory patterns changing, and so on, ice conditions changing, becoming unsafe, and so on. And as important as those issues are, they still rank lower than all of the other issues. Suicide rates and food security and dealing with mining companies and on and on and on. So that's something we need to get our heads around. And the other thing is, Zandrea, when we were preparing for this, she mentioned that there's a lack of there's a kind of hopelessness and helplessness, and we certainly see that with our students, and each passing year it gets more profound. It's almost kind of apocalyptic, and that's combined with what can I possibly do? And so how do we rebuild both hope and agency at the same time? And I would say there's at least three things we can do. One is we need to tell stories of how change has happened in the past, including the recent past. Big scale social change, because there are many stories and we know how those have worked in the past. The second thing is we just need to get young people involved in community, volunteering. And there is a good research that if you get involved in an issue from an activist lens or a volunteering lens or any kind of active citizenship, your level of hope increases in general. And then the third thing is people are feeling overwhelmed by the complexity and like, what can I possibly do? And so tools that allow people to approach complexity in a way that makes sense of it, that helps it break down, moving away from our kind of, tendency towards a reductionist and quantized approach to see context, to see flow, to see relationships and connections. And so one of the things we really place a strong emphasis on is systems thinking tools, which does not come naturally to education, whether it's K-12, whether it's post-secondary, whether it's adult education. There's still relatively little systems infused education going on. So I would say we need to double down on those kinds of efforts if we want to make a dent.
Thank you, James, for mentioning that. There's quite a few fellows in Wales who are looking at kind of revised curriculums and curriculums for the future. So I'm glad you're able to bring that aspect in about how young people are feeling and changes to education to Lydia.
Hi, thank you. I loved the way you all presented what's going on in your parts of the world. I'm a coach and I specialize in climate and biodiversity coaching and livable futures, habitable futures. So it's all the same sort of way we're trying to see how behavior change and how neuroscience affects change, and the visceral sense of agency and also personal, close to your heart, basically, and what matters. So I think everything, I just want to agree with everything, but I suppose it's more in say leadership teams in businesses. What are you seeing as the blockers for taking action and responsibility?
I could speak to that a little bit. As a systems practitioner myself, and I couldn't agree more that we need to transform educational systems. And in some of my work, I'm trying to uphold that accessibility and democratizing element, because even though the challenge is that frankly systems thinking itself is colonized, and so we're trying to break down some of those silos that have ironically emerged from systems thinking, to make it more accessible, because we believe that it's actually inherent in our nature to think in systems, and that it's just sort of been trained out of us. So as it relates to business leadership, I think the challenge, as I think about like where are the acupressure points or acupuncture points that we can press on, the truth is business leaders are playing by the rules of the game that have been established. Public companies anyway. We see the B Corp movement arising for private companies. It gives people an opportunity to redesign the governance structures and allows them to attend to the things that really matter as they conduct business. But the vast majority of publicly led companies are playing by the rules that have been established for them by the, whether it's the FTSE or the SEC or, regulatory bodies. So to me, that's the most, thinking about addressing those incentives and aligning incentives in service to life is really ultimately going to be the most effective intervention. But you hear whisperings and murmurings of some leaders who understand and know in their hearts that this kind of transformation is necessary, but they're sort of trapped in their obligations to their stakeholders as we know them. So it's there's some tension there. We've heard, and we've also heard co-option of this language of regeneration by certain key players in the Fortune 500 or Fortune 100, where, you know, part of, I think, our obligation responsibility is to help ensure that that co-option doesn't continue, and that we sort of affirm the reality of what it actually means in very public ways, so that this doesn't become, you know, yet another runaway train that leads us to nowhere.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really important that we find our way through some of these blocks. So Lydia, thank you for raising that. And that resonates a little bit with Jonathan, your comment in the chat. I wondered if you wanted just to speak to that for a moment, talking about engagement.
Yeah, thank you. And I do apologize. I have a hard stop at 10 o'clock, so I can't stay on for too much longer. But yeah, I was just curious if others, you know, were talking about equity and around climate change, and this is something in my professional life I deal with quite a bit, just because, although not specific to climate change, as I mentioned in the chat, but with regard to broader kind of disaster preparedness and response for the human services, healthcare, and public health sectors or spaces. And we've been, you know, a lot of people talk about equity in my world, but it becomes quite challenging when you try to convert those concepts into like practical day-to-day actions that leaders or service providers can take. And so, you know, one of the things that we've been doing both in the healthcare world as well as in the now human services world, and human services, for those that may not know that term, these are things for like kind of social welfare programs, so nutrition and shelter or other temporary services that people might need. But in a disaster environment, this means like making sure people have, you know, water, shelter, you know, get reunited with their families, and these sort of things. So, but one of the things that we did was we conducted sort of an internal rapid study, I guess, about how we can turn these equity concepts into more practical actions. And the three things I think that we're sort of promoting across my work is like with my clients is like being able to quantify and qualify populations that are likely to be most impacted by disasters or large public health or healthcare emergencies, and then engaging, if they can engage them directly, great, but otherwise engage the community-based organizations or other organizations that sort of represent those populations, to make sure that, you know, you have a channel through which you can learn about them or communicate them or even access those populations when it comes to disaster response. And number three is having like formalized representation of those groups, whether it's through associations or community-based organizations, in things like incident management being like the coordination of emergency response or disaster response on a large scale. So those things, those are sort of the three things that we've been trying to promote across like emergency management for the sectors that I support.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that to the conversation, Jonathan. And I know that many of us will also be turning our heads towards the time for our conversation. So we'll, I invite anybody who has a response or a resource in relation to what Jonathan shared, to either add that into the chat, and of course we can continue the conversation through the RSA circle. I'm grateful for all of the sharing, both the sharing that you've no doubt had for yourself in the quiet, as well as the ones that we've spoken into the space, and for the shift that we've made in the short term between sharing how climate change has been present to us, but also some of the changes in our practice, our professional work, and our community life, including that and Martin, of course, shared in the chat at the beginning. So thank you for listening in, for talking, and also to Nishan and to James and to Kerry for sharing. I'm going to pass the word back to Tony now, just to offer.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation today. As Kate mentioned, if you are a fellow, we will be continuing the conversation in the RSA's online platform circle. If you are not a fellow, we will be sending a follow-up email with all of the links included in the chat, likely additional links that we didn't include in the chat as well. And if you're interested in becoming a fellow, you can do so on the RSA's website. There are also a lot of different initiatives that the RSA is engaged in around this work, including the RSA's capability work, Playful Green Planet, our social connections work, and other things that you can also access on our website. A recording of this video will be posted on our YouTube channel within a couple of business days. And with that, I wish you all a fantastic day. Thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us and continue to engage in this space. Take care and be well all.